Hi, everybody, and welcome to Close of Business Tuesday. We've got a fantastic discussion for you today. We're really lucky to have Naomi with us. She's the Managing Director of the Stanford Natural Gas Initiative. So today is all things natural gas. Welcome, Naomi. We're so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, Naomi, while you get ready, we'll just do a few minutes of what's going on in the world. Mike Bradley, tell me something good, brother.
Well, I'll tell you something good and then maybe a little bit something bad afterwards. But the good is, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about crude oil's having a little bit of trouble here. Time spreads were weak. You had Libya coming on pretty strong. You had cheaters in OPEC, and you had essentially the market was going sideways. And what we had here is last week crude rallied from $37, $38 up to $40, $41 today. And a lot of that was based on, expectations that we were going to get a stimulus bill. And, and some things that were going positively. For example, Saudi Arabia OSPs were actually not as discounted as people thought. So that shows some good signs for demand there. UAE is coming back into it's lowering production, next month. So that's a good thing. Libya is not going up as high as most people thought, as quickly as people thought. So I think the market right now, time spreads are starting to go sideways, which is just telling you the market is not that concerned right now. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that mid afternoon today, it looked like President Trump came out and said that the stimulus bill is officially dead. They're not going to renegotiate that until after the election. Of course, actually after he wins, according to what he's saying. So you had the market really, trade off today. Risk off trade really started to kick in, and you got some, some concerning comments coming from Jerome Powell that the recovery is not going to be as strong. So, we've had 3, 4, 5 days of a risk on trade, and we've got a little bit of a risk off trade at least this afternoon. So the market's kind of in limbo.
Okay.
Now the thing I'd say too, Maynard, is that now you have a new storm hitting the Gulf of Mexico here. Delta. It's Cat 4, and it's probably going to be taking out some crude oil and some natural gas production, maybe up to 2 BCF of natural gas. So, that's actually provided some stimulus for crude oil and natural gas. So at least we got that going for us. But we're going to have to deal with the effects of demand later this week and into next week.
So we have a Washington hurricane that's not going well for us, and we have a Gulf of Mexico one that we'll keep our fingers crossed is good for prices but doesn't hurt anything.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, Matt, what's up with you, my friend?
Yeah, Maynard. I just wanted to share a quick slide deck that the research team put out last week, really addressing a topic that has been front and center in investors' minds over the last few weeks. And this really came on the back of Governor Newsom's announcement in California to potentially ban ICE vehicles by 2035. Now, there's a lot of questions around the feasibility of this and the implementation of the process. But what we would say is California is one of the states in the U.S. that has already been pushing pretty aggressively for EV adoption. They have a couple of different systems in place that essentially are incentivizing OEMs to produce EVs and also have additional rebates above and beyond federal tax credits, which help consumers buy cars. So first and foremost, just wanted to put California into context. Why is it important? It is actually a state in the U.S. that actually rivals some of the countries globally. So when you look at total auto sales over the last 4 to 5 years, California sold about 2 million vehicles, a little bit north of 2 million vehicles a year. That actually compares similar in size to the UK, Canada, or Italy. So from a policy standpoint, it matters. Secondly, they have a long-standing target they've been talking about for quite some time of reaching 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And they have put incentives in place to do that. And I'll cover a couple of those things in a few minutes here. Now, to frame the total context of California, how large is the market? It's about 30 million vehicles on the road. So one thing that we do talk a lot about in terms of vehicle penetration, new sales are one thing, but replacement and turnover of the auto fleet is another. And it takes a really long time to kill off demand. So while there's a lot of scary headlines out there from a new sales perspective, as we've talked about in some of the other countries globally, it does take some time for that fleet to turn over. So here are some of the details we just wanted to run through. On top of the U.S. rebate, which is basically a federal rebate for purchasing electric vehicles, which is up to $7,500 for a new car, California actually has its own rebate system, which is financed through a cap and trade setup. And that actually allows consumers to get another $2,000 for purchasing electric vehicles. But again, it's purchased through a cap and trade system. To date, they've paid out almost $900 million in rebates. And from a sales perspective in 2019, EVs and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles were about 7% of new sales. And we do have that ramping to about 14% by 2025. On the bottom left-hand side of this chart, I just wanted to show you a quick summary of the government's budget and policy as it relates to reaching their 5 million target. They think they need about $5.6 billion in financing to do so. So that will be something to closely watch as we move forward. And then lastly, this is an important component as well. The state has a ZEV credit system set up where essentially auto manufacturers have to meet certain targets from a credit standpoint. In 2018, 4.5% of the sales under a credit system needed to be generated through some sort of electric vehicle. And by 2025, about 22% needed to be from this credit system. And those credits can be traded. So Tesla actually generates a lot of credits in California because electric vehicles are worth a lot more credits. And they sell those to basically generate profit. So one thing we'd be watching for here, as other OEMs ramp their EV capacity, what does that really mean to the value of these credits as other manufacturers actually reach their targets and that credit system starts to come into balance? So here's the last page I really wanted to cover, and then we'll cover maybe one slide on power. This is our TPH forecast on the auto market. So on the bottom left-hand side of the chart, we're looking at how we're thinking about gasoline demand. As you can see, in 2016, basically gasoline demand in California had already peaked. And what's driving this is really a shift in fuel efficiency. So we're fighting kind of two headwinds in the US. One, we're fighting fuel efficiency standards on ICE vehicles. And then secondarily, we're also having an increase in EV penetration, which obviously has very little, if any, consumption, depending on if it's a plug-in hybrid or not. 2020, a big dip here. That's really related to COVID. So we do think we've seen about a 15% drop in demand in 2020. In 2021, we're forecasting about a 5% drop in demand due to COVID. And by 2022, we get back to kind of a normalized setup. However, what we would highlight here, the market peaked at about a little north of 1 million barrels a day of gasoline demand in California in 2015 and 2016. And we do forecast by 2030 that will drop to about 940,000 barrels a day. So even though we have this big ramp in electric vehicles, which you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, that dynamic around the fleet turnover and how long it actually takes for that fleet to be replaced from electric vehicles essentially takes a long time for gasoline demand to erode. And lastly, just in terms of our target, we are undershooting the state's targets pretty significantly. So as we talked about, the state's targeting 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. We think they're only going to reach about 3.3 based on our current forecast. So either something needs to change from a rebate and policy perspective, or we need to see electric vehicles reach ICE parity so you see faster adoption. Otherwise, we think the state's goals might fall a little bit short, and really the big erosion in demand actually starts to occur in 2030 through 2040.
Matt, I know all of this is new and there's a lot of moving pieces, but do you hear stuff about you hear people make jokes about Arizona and Nevada. ICE dealerships will do well if California does this. Any of the dealers in California pushing back, saying, how can you, say, because, my car company may not have a lot of electric vehicles that I won't be, you're hurting my property. Like, what's the fallout? I guess the last one would be, do we really need to continue subsidizing this when companies like Tesla are now twice the size of Exxon? Like, why do we need to keep subsidizing this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And really what's interesting is the targets they're setting forth really actually, quite frankly, align fairly well with the changes that OEMs have announced over the last 1 to 2 years. So if you think about GM's strategy or Ford's strategy in the US, they're actually starting to set targets that would represent, in the case of GM, about 15% of their sales by 2025 coming from electric vehicles. If you think about the European auto manufacturers, most have targets of reaching about 25% of their sales by 2025 coming from electric vehicles, and they're building capacity around that. And then, as I wanted to highlight on this slide, in terms of the largest sellers in California, Toyota is the largest seller of vehicles in California, and I only bring them up because by 2025, Toyota thinks 50% of their new sales are going to come from electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So the big picture is, while there's a slow kind of adoption around the consumer side, I think it actually aligns with the big strategic shift that we've seen from auto OEMs. And because Europe and China in particular are making a big push on electrification, the US in terms of size and scale is pretty comparable. And so when you're a global OEM, as you think about your global strategy, if 2 of your 3 big regions globally are changing, you have to make a decision whether you're in or out on that strategy. And we are seeing a shift from a broad picture perspective. I do agree from a rebate and subsidy perspective, this does need to go away at some point. I think the industry is getting some time here because we're still not at parity with ICE vehicles. And again, TPH does not have its own forecast as of yet. But a lot of the work that we've seen from some other think tanks generally suggests by mid-decade that battery electric vehicles will basically reach ICE parity on an unsubsidized basis. And at that point, it really comes down to your fuel cost, which obviously, depending on what happens with power, really comes into play in terms of the cost of total ownership.
Okay, great. Well, I know as we talk to Naomi here in just a minute, we'll probably hit on some of this, what's happening in California for sure. Colin, what's on your mind, my friend, as we pause to hear your thoughts pre-Naomi?
Well, picking up on that thread from Matt, where we have the domestic situation centered on California, internationally, we had a big announcement from China. You probably saw that the Chinese have announced a net zero target for CO2 by 2060, and Tsinghua University came out shortly thereafter with some suggested roadmaps on how we might get there. Now, we'll get the final details of what the plan is at the end of the month with the next 5-year plan from the official state government apparatus, but we thought it'd be useful just to put some numbers on what is being kicked around. The first thing to know is that hydrocarbons will, according to plan, drop by 65% for oil demand, 75% for gas, and about 95% for coal. That's the plan. That would drop the hydrocarbon mix of total from about 80% in 2025 to under 15% by 2060. And as you can imagine, the share for renewables goes from just below 10 in the year 2025 to above 50. Now, you know, the best laid plans of human beings have a tendency to go awry. One thing that captures our attention in this, yes, I'm going to say it, nuclear, goes from 3.41 million barrels per day oil equivalent in 2025 to 16.5 million barrels per day. That is a 382% projected increase, which actually outpaces wind at 346. And the reason I flag it is you may have seen in the past week, MIT and others have been talking a lot about fusion possibly actually being a reality as soon as 2030 to 2035. Now, all of us are guessing here, and I'd be interested in hearing Naomi's thoughts as a legitimate scientist, as opposed to us economists trying to predict what might or may not happen. But I think it is important just to flag that the media would have the story be hydrocarbons fall, renewables rise, don't talk so much about nuclear. Nuclear is a key portion of this roadmap, and that's one thing to keep in mind. The other aspect that really jumps out from this roadmap from the Chinese government is an expectation that Chinese total primary energy demand will peak sometime around the year 2030 to 2035, and thereafter fall on a cumulative basis by about 20% from 2025 to 2060. Now, it is true that there are demographic reasons to support that with a projected peaking of the Chinese population later in this century, but that is a pretty big number. And so that is a weakness in this roadmap. And clearly, when you have round numbers like minus 65%, minus 75, and minus 95 those are aspirational, and we're clearly doing all the math backwards to make sure we get those percentages. And so it hinges critically on the intensities that actually are achieved. Quickly, I just wanted to pick up on another point that Mike made, and that is we've had this sideways motion in markets for the past month or so. Obviously, we had a pretty nice movement up in equity markets, gold, silver, Bitcoin, all the things we talked about, and now we've been going sideways. When we look at the options markets, it's pretty clear that the one bet that global markets are making is that we will not stay in this sideways regime for much longer. We're going to either break to the downside, hopefully not, but that's getting a rising probability attached to it, or to the upside. And in particular, when we look at energy, the gas market is very much skewed up for the winter. Oil is skewed down. And so when you see a major airline manufacturer come out today and warn about soft demand for the next decade, you can get a sense of why oil is behaving the way that it is. We also are seeing on the downside a lot of seriously not great indicators from restaurants, real estate, vacancies, and so on all over North America. But to be fair, on the positive side, we're also seeing a breakout in the price of spot palladium, according to the Johnson Matthey price, and also the share prices of lithium producers in Latin America. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Drawing the string all together, I would say, what a week. We had two really important aspirational declarations from the governments of California and China. We've had a lot of noise around COVID and what may or may not happen because of the second wave of cases that we're seeing. But lurking around the edges, a vision of the future that perhaps is not as dire as some people have portrayed it to be, and one where you're starting to see some real opportunity, not only in the land of energy, but also in metals.
Do you think it's interesting, Colin, that this Chinese 2060 plan, and then I think it's also in the BP Statistical Survey that these projections of energy use either leveling off or after a certain point going down, or because most of the projections that seem to say we'll use more oil and gas assume we're going to have many more people and we're going to have a lot more demand. And we're starting to see these forecasts which are suggesting more people, less demand, or less per person. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, anytime you do a long run projection, there are two major drivers, number of people and number of dollars. And so when you project deep into the 21st century, if you're going to say you have 2 billion more people and 100 trillion more real dollars every year, it's really, really hard to get the genie back in the bottle and get demand numbers to go down. Yes, you can have intensities of use through CAFE standards or whatever it may be, give us some broad sweep improvements. But just to give you one heuristic to think about this, historically, the BP database would show you that we might get 1 to 1.5% efficiencies, to use the term they use, per year on a global basis. In order to achieve the net zero scenario that they have projected, it's not a forecast, to be fair, it's just a scenario, which totally gets mangled whenever the press tries to describe this. But in order to get those numbers to balance out, you have to double that efficiency. So imagine in your own life taking out 2% of your personal demand in a year over and over and over again. It doesn't sound like a lot until you start thinking about how many days 2% of 365 is. You're starting to count up to a week. So for the next week, please use no energy whatsoever and tell me how that goes for you in terms of heating, driving, taking care of your kids, and the rest. One other point on, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, is this hydrogen idea. I'm really keenly focused on the fact that over and over again in the list of wonderful toys to come in the land of energy, hydrogen is now number 2 often, ahead of electric vehicles. And this is something we've been waiting for a while, because if you run the math, you're going to have natural gas. And yet, if you're not allowed to talk about fossil fuels, you got to tiptoe into now talking about them as hydrocarbons, and then even further into talking about them as hydrogen. And so it's just one statistic. If you take a look at that net zero scenario in the BP forecast, they've got upwards of 20% of final energy demand will come from hydrogen in the year 2050. If you read even more closely, they say 5% will come from gray hydrogen, and the balance will be split between blue and green. Put that in plain English, that means something like 52% of hydrogen comes from natural gas, meaning that 10% of global primary demand comes from natural gas. So all we've done is we've taken out the number 2 pencil and we've erased the words natural gas, and we've typed in we've written in the more palatable word hydrogen. And so if you're going to be intellectually honest about it, reasonable people can say, yes, I want to get it from water, I want to get it from wherever, but you have to understand that that's what happened here. And yet when we look at the natural gas production numbers for out to 2050, they zero out. So how can you have something that accounts for 10% of demand but 0% of supply?
Okay, well, thanks, guys. I kind of got us on a bit of a tangent there, so I apologize. Naomi, it's so exciting to have you. I've got to formally introduce you, though, because the crowd needs to know how lucky we all are. So you are the managing director at Stanford's Natural Gas Initiative. You were at Chevron for quite a long time, 13 years, I think, in technical and managerial positions. You've been on a part of the UN expert group on resource clarification. You have a PhD from Stanford, a master's from Indiana, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Leeds. I was thinking of you when Colin was doing hydrogen humor. You started the hydrogen group there at Stanford. So we are so lucky to have you and so excited. There's no topic from natural gas to hydrogen to California vehicle proposals that we can't touch on today, but welcome. And so big round of applause for Naomi. We're really excited to have you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to chat with you too. Being at an academic institution and getting out and talking to lots of people is right in my wheelhouse. So this is a really great opportunity. So I have a few slides. I thought maybe I would share those, and then we can discuss all manner of natural gas issues. So I'm going to talk about natural gas in the era of decarbonization. And although it's my name on this slide, these are the thoughts and ideas of a collective force from Stanford University. So the Natural Gas Initiative was formed in 2015 out of the realization of how important natural gas was for decarbonization and the energy landscape at large. So we have about 7 focus areas, and we have about 40 research groups at Stanford that are involved in all manner of research projects related to natural gas. And they range from sort of nuts and bolts physical sciences through to economics and policy. And we have some new focus areas around hydrogen, as you were just mentioning. And we are funded both through the university and from our affiliate members that are shown here. So we have a really great diverse group of affiliate members ranging from large integrated oil companies to venture capital firms to NGOs and utilities. And given our membership base, we adopt a very sort of pragmatic approach to how natural gas can be used in the energy landscape. Our mission is really to do fundamental research around the social, economic, and environmental benefits of natural gas. So I think one of the things, that I am so happy about is that finally we're done sort of arguing over whether or not global warming is happening. The need to decarbonize is beyond dispute. And the graph on the left sort of shows the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions that we would have to reduce to in order to meet both the 2-degree scenario and the 3-degree scenario. We're all being affected by global warming, whether it's floods or fires. Certainly in my home state of California, right now we are stuck indoors more often than not due to the smoke. This is very, very real and very real across the globe. But the good news, and I have to start with the good news because I'm an earth scientist and we're by nature optimists, is that to limit warming to 2 degrees, we're talking about 4% of reductions in emissions. And that really isn't out of reach. So we do need to move quickly, and I'll talk about a little bit about the timing of this. But I really think that we still have a really good chance of limiting the impact of this. So of course, you know, we have all these other issues, and it's sort of like a perfect storm. So we have an expanding population with a projected increase in energy demand. And so we're talking about how do we provide twice as much energy that is accessible and equitable and it's affordable, whilst also maintaining national security interests. And we want to do all of this while we're protecting the planet. And so the Natural Gas Initiative at Stanford is really trying to look at this problem in a very holistic and pragmatic way. So I thought today I'd touch on 4 things that are, you know, really close to my heart and to the heart of the researchers in my organization. The first is that the unconventional gas revolution over the last 10 years has provided us with an abundance of gas that we didn't know we had. And there are opportunities that come with that to decarbonize the electrical power sector. The second point is, you know, we're often, I think, so focused on decarbonizing at home that we forget that out in other countries there are pressing needs still to provide clean and safe cooking and heating fuels. And then coming back to the US, I'm going to share some thoughts around why natural gas will continue to be a critical part of the energy system and how we ensure it's as sustainable as possible. And then finally, I really believe that the oil and gas industry has a responsibility in achieving the carbon dioxide emissions. So I'm going to talk about some of the technical ways that they could participate in that. So just to ground the conversation, right? We, 8 years ago, I think I was at Chevron and I was working on unconventionals, and we really didn't know what the potential was. But now it's very clear that we have this unprecedented resource. In fact, we have about a 200-year supply of natural gas. So the abundance and the affordability that goes along with that of gas means that it is going to be part of future energy systems. And of course, gas in the United States has been associated with really a remarkable decarbonization as natural gas became abundant. It replaced the old coal plants. And so the graph on the left here just shows the increase in gas production. And that's the red line on the right graph. And you can see that from about 2007, 2008, as gas production skyrockets, carbon dioxide emissions go down. And I really don't think this gets enough airtime. This is an amazing story and success. And it really does demonstrate the opportunity for fuel switching from coal to gas.
Can I just ask you, Naomi,
Yeah.
because we agree with you on that previous slide there, and so the fact that fracking, by making natural gas plentiful and cheap, helped us reduce CO2 emissions, like it's a striking thing. And when you look at the, not to introduce the election, it's everybody's favorite topic, but I think all of us in energy land just cry for some more transparency and candor around what happened here.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think in 2008, I was a geophysicist working on how to produce natural gas, right? And we were looking at fracking. In particular, I was using little earthquakes to understand how the fractures were propagating. And we were, I think, as an industry, so busy developing this revolutionary technology, horizontal wells, and fracturing, that we didn't stop to really tell the story of how gas was changing the lives of the American people through reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So I always start with this because I think it really is remarkable, and it really does deserve to have its story told in a way that is heard. And you're right, there's so much politics involved right now that this is getting lost. But as somebody that worked on fracking for many years and has access to some of the best researchers in the world looking at the safety of fracking, I 110% believe that we should continue to produce natural gas because its impact on reducing CO2 emissions is critical. And the risk from fracking is so minimal. And in fact, the earthquakes that have happened in places like Oklahoma, we now understand how that is caused, and we know how to avoid it, right, by reducing the fluid pressure. So for me, it's a no-brainer. And, so we've had this great success story in the States, and there is still a need to eliminate coal elsewhere. So I'm really interested. Colin mentioned that China has some new targets around coal. Right now, there are 300 gigawatts of coal generation capacity under construction in Asia, most of it funded by China. And certainly in the next 20 years, we are going to see increased carbon dioxide emissions associated with the increased use of coal, primarily in China and India. I think, India is a really interesting case study because we're seeing coal use increase. We're also seeing unprecedented shares of renewables. So they're targeting 44% renewable energy by 2030. But the increase in demand that we just talked about with the increasing population and the access to energy for more people means that the coal use is going up. And certainly we currently are projecting that for China as well. So, the question really is, how do we make natural gas cheaper than coal? So the plot on the right is shows all of the places in the world where there's currently some kind of pricing scheme, and you can pick your flavor of that. And there's about 50 countries or states or territories that have some kind of pricing scheme. So it covers about 13% of the current emissions. And the IAEA is saying that we need somewhere on the order of $60 a ton to really trigger avoided emissions from coal to gas switching. So currently, this all averages out to about $2 a ton, which is, just nowhere near. And I think it's really telling that big integrated oil companies, BP in particular, have put their money where their mouth is, and they are lobbying for carbon pricing. So I think we're going to see an increased move in this direction. And of course, there's a price that maximizes gas consumption because it displaces coal, but it avoids the displacement of gas by renewables, right? So, this is kind of a sliding scale, and somewhere in there, there's the right mix.
Naomi, how does this fit in with if you just had the simple objective of trying to get the Chinese and the Indians to not go on this, to not do all this new coal?
It's a great question, because I have a slide later on where I actually put it in words on the slide. I think it's hypocritical of us, right, to prevent developing countries from meeting their energy access goals by imposing our decarbonization targets upon them. And certainly a global carbon price, right, if it was applied equally everywhere, would do that. So, I believe, like at a moral high level, that the developed world needs to figure out a way to put carbon pricing in place that does not penalize developing countries. So, I'm not an economist, but I do know that there's a lot of work going on at Stanford, particularly within the Hoover Institution, around this exact issue. Yeah, so energy poverty is a reality for billions. In fact, one of the reasons that I decided to leave Chevron and come to Stanford was because I really wanted to work on this topic after seeing poverty for myself in Nigeria when I was out there working. And so this is the most recent report from the IAEA, right? So we have about 800,000 people without access to electricity. India has made great strides in this, but you'll see the big green bar, that's sub-Saharan Africa. So almost no progress has been made in getting electricity of any form to sub-Saharan Africa. And another key issue is around the use of thermal fuels. So people using biomass, wood, dirty, polluting stoves to cook and heat their homes with. And there are about over 2.5 billion people that are still using these dirty fuels. And in a world with an abundance of LPG, to me, that just seems like a travesty. And of course, here's the slide with it's the height of hypocrisy, right, to deny energy. But it's true that when we look at, wealthy countries, there are no countries that fall into the upper quartile in terms of national income on the y-axis here that don't have high energy use. And so, the US, the bubbles are proportional to the size of the population. And so, our goal should be to move everybody upwards, but of course that can't be done without moving them also across the chart by increasing their access to energy. And just a word on these thermal fuels, there are 4 million people dying a year through the use of these dirty fuels, right? So to put that in context, that is more than malaria, AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. There has been a lot of progress in India, but in Africa, this remains a big problem. And so at Stanford, we have been working with companies on how to put into effect really kind of innovative business models, pay-as-you-go business models to get clean cooking stoves out to people. And then also thinking about this at the higher level, right? We often, companies often think about getting gas to other countries through these big, tens of billions of dollar projects, right? Big LNG plants. Are there other business models we could use which don't require expensive pipeline infrastructure, for example, the use of things like modular LNG. So there's a lot of work going on in the business school and in the School of Economics looking at how we can make progress at both large and small scales. And then coming back to the developed world, right? I mean, last September, 6 million people turned out to demand change. And I fully support the need for change, but I think, we need to put some really hard work and dollars into developing the technology that's going to get there. So just to talk about that a little bit, using California as an example, this is a timeline of the key California policies, right? So, I think everybody agrees that up to about 2035, it's going to be difficult, but it's doable, right? So we've got, 60% renewables in our electricity mix and 5 million electric cars. I think at Stanford, we are working hard to make this a reality, and I think that we're on the right track. Right now, we're at somewhere on the order of about 35% renewables in our electricity mix, and certainly with costs coming down in that, I think getting to 60% is not beyond the realm of possibility. But after about 2035, there are a number of targets which really don't have any technical pathways, right? How do we get to 100% zero carbon? We are not there by a long shot, right? And so, I think we are trying to actively figure out what those technical pathways are, and certainly getting to net negative emissions. There is no technology on the table right now that is going to turn back the clock on carbon. So when we think about natural gas, we're really trying to sort of look at it in a pragmatic way. And certainly I and all the people I work with are technology agnostic in many ways, right? We want to get to the goals, and we're just saying right now renewables, this is a study out of MIT actually, but there's been similar work from Stanford as well. We're looking at something like a 90% cost in the storage for renewables to really become a feasible alternative to natural gas. And so, I think like many have witnessed this sort of very partisan approach to energy, right? It's like either all renewables or all fossil fuels, and you can't, it's kind of like a war, and it's scary. The narrative, I think, is really a false narrative, because renewables, and I certainly support renewables. Stanford does a lot of work in this space, but right now we are not in a position to move to 100% renewable energy. There is going to be other components. And so we are thinking about gas in this much bigger integrated system. I think, Colin, you mentioned hydrogen, and hydrogen is certainly going to play a role. I think, 20 years ago, there were hydrogen research programs in, I think, all the integrated oil companies, and we all thought it was very cool, but nobody could really see how it would be applied. And when the price dropped, it was sort of the first thing that got dispelled. And now the interest in hydrogen has made this massive resurgence. And I think for the first time, we see very clear applications of how it could be used. And it's really not a fuel. It's really because, I think except for one well in Malawi, you can't go out and drill for hydrogen, right? It all got burned off into the ocean billions of years ago. So it's not a naturally occurring free source of energy. So what we're talking about is really using it as a storage mechanism. So we take some other energy source, whether it's curtailed renewable energy or natural gas, we make the hydrogen and we're using it to store that energy. And so for grid storage, that's a very clear application. And the other place I think it's going to become very important is in long distance transportation, where the downtime associated with charging batteries, the weight of the battery, the size of the battery means that for trucks, hydrogen might be a more compelling alternative.
Our power team did put together some forecasts over the next 20 years. We do expect demand just from EVs to grow about 0.6%. And it puts a lot of stress in the system, especially with those longer term targets around going 100% renewable. So the two key questions that we've been focused on, one, because California is so heavily reliant on solar, how much does battery technology play into that transition, especially if the state is working towards that zero carbon discussion and potentially moving natural gas from the state? And then two, our calculation looked like it came up with about 440,000 acres would be necessary from just a footprint perspective. So how important is land use in this conversation, especially when it comes to solar?
Yeah, no, so let's just go back to this slide just to kind of frame the discussion. Yeah, so I think you raise a number of really good points, right? So the first thing is, when we're talking about 5 million electric vehicles, that is quadrupling the existing energy demand for the electric grid. So there's been a number of studies on this, right? So we're talking about increasing the grid demand by a factor of 4. At the same time, you're correct, moving to higher and higher solar. Potentially offshore wind will become important in California, but probably not before the 2030 targets. And so the storage is incredibly important. So, the studies that I've seen around this that have come out of Stanford indicate that going from 90% renewables to 100% renewables is an increasing cost of a factor of 5. And certainly I've seen numerous studies on the use of land, and you're right, it's an incredible volume, right? That there was sort of that now infamous Tesla map that showed that it was a very small patch, and that has sort of been shown not to be the case. So yeah, I think all of those are aspects that we're actively working on. But the battery storage side of this is incredibly important, and that's really why hydrogen is receiving the attention, because everybody recognizes that it has this potential for storing energy in a way that would sort of lessen the demand for batteries.
So Naomi, one question for you. It's maybe a slight non sequitur, but we're on EVs, and I'm going to share a photo. You guys can't see it, but I was behind a Tesla this weekend, and the license plate just spells out "no fuel." And clearly, this person in this in the vehicle, it's a lovely vehicle, thinks they're using no fuel. What is it about electric vehicles? Obviously, there's no emissions, but why can't people get their head around, the power comes from somewhere. Yeah. The batteries are going to be put in a landfill somewhere. What are we going crazy on these EVs without really thinking them through?
Well, that's a great question. There was a study that was done by Professor at Stanford, Inez Azevedo, where she looked at the real footprint, carbon footprint, and emissions associated with EVs state by state, right? And it really, I think this is a lack of understanding by the general public on how energy works in general, right? So, when you plug your car into the wall, no, people aren't out there thinking, well, that's connected somewhere back to, a gas plant or a renewable network, right? And so whether or not, I think one thing's for clear is that electric vehicles reduce air pollution, right? So that is a given. So that is, across the board. But whether or not they are better in terms of carbon emissions than gasoline cars really depends on where you live and what the mix of energy is that is being used to generate your electricity. So in California, electric vehicles are better because we have a high share of renewables and because we use gas for the remainder of that, basically. If you move to other parts of the country where they're still using coal plants, it is worse, right? So really, when you're buying an electric vehicle, you have to stop and say, well, what is the fuel mix making up my electricity? And how is that, better or worse than using a gasoline car? Because it's not true that they're better everywhere. Yeah. But these are public misconceptions, and certainly, at Stanford, we try really hard to educate the public, but there is some, I think, a fundamental, lack of knowledge around where energy comes from.
Colin and I were talking about this, which is we're obsessed with nuclear. I don't know what it is. We're always talking about nuclear. And what is it that bothers us so much about nuclear? And I think it's because it seems like if you can't recognize the benefits of nuclear, then you're not being intellectually honest. There's something about nuclear where if you are dismissive of it, then you somehow can't be serious about the problem. what do you think about nuclear? I guess we've come to think of it as almost like this weird, not litmus test, but there's something about it that bothers you.
Well, I think from a public perception, right, when you talk to the average person on the street about nuclear, what pops into their mind is probably Chernobyl or something equally devastating. And so there is a public perception issue around nuclear energy, for sure. that wields itself politically. I think the other thing is that, and I'm not an expert on nuclear, but my understanding, talking to experts, is that the costs associated with nuclear just cannot compete right now with gas and coal. So, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see nuclear become a big part of the energy mix in the United States. And I think it's very interesting, to hear that China is actively looking at nuclear as part of their energy mix. I think how different countries have thought about nuclear. In France, they and Germany, they've sort of phased out a lot of their nuclear now, and certainly in Germany, we've ended up in a situation where they've had to rely more and more on coal. So these are important considerations, and I don't think it should be. I think it should be on the table as a viable source of energy, but I think there's a lot of hurdles to overcome there.
Well, I think where we get really fussy is this idea where we're shutting down nuclear plants that already have been built, are producing power, amortized, but for another day. Let's let you finish up your slides, just so because we got to get the gang in here. I know everybody's itchy to ask you questions.
Great. Okay. Well, let me zip forward here to where we were. So here's a view of the future. This happens to come from the BP Energy Outlook, but IAEA, EIA, Exxon, Shell, they all have a very similar outlook for the future. And that's that oil and coal are going to remain pretty much the same. And the new demand for energy, the energy growth, is going to be accommodated mostly from gas and renewables. But the emissions picture is not great. We still see emissions continuing to increase out to 2040 and beyond, although at a slightly slower rate. So I think one of the things that we need to do, given the reality that gas is going to be a part of these energy systems in the future, is really think about how we can make it as sustainable and clean as possible. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is around that, on methane emissions detection and mitigation, both on quantifying the scale and the impact. There is still a lot of debate and controversy around top-down versus bottoms-up estimates. But I think one thing is clear, that there are a number of what we've termed super emitters that are responsible for about 50% of the leakage. And those are relatively easy to detect. And, mitigation for those is a no-brainer. There have been studies that have talked about how the leakage associated with the use of natural gas might negate the climate benefits relative to coal. And the work coming out of Stanford just shows that that is not the case. There are now numerous technologies that are being employed to really mitigate any kind of methane leaks from the natural gas system. So we've been doing a lot of work also on designing new technologies. We're really proud. We had a couple of postdocs design some new types of methane sensors, and they've started a company. And we've been instrumental in testing commercial technologies and doing kind of head-to-head challenges by releasing methane in known quantities and seeing how they are able to detect it. And it's led to some really exciting innovations in that space. So even if we, use natural gas as clean as possible, we really do have a issue with the carbon dioxide emissions. So this graph is from the IEA, and it shows in gigatons the amount of carbon dioxide that would have to be captured and stored per year in order to achieve that 2-degree scenario. And it's broken up into power, industry, and other, but that's sort of irrelevant. So just the curve, right, is increasing rapidly after 2020. And here's where we're at on carbon capture and storage. We're at 30 megatons a year. It's so small it doesn't even register on this graph. And this is a very well-established, known technology. So taking carbon dioxide and injecting it underground, often in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, but it could also be in saline aquifers. Okay, so here's where we need to be in the next 15 years or so in order to avoid the 2-degree scenario. No, brand new technologies withstanding. And it just so happens that this volume is equivalent to the current global oil and gas production of about 30 billion barrels a year equivalent. So for me, it's really kind of, a no-brainer that the oil and gas industry need to step up and start figuring out ways to make carbon capture and storage a commercial prospect. And indeed, at Stanford, we're working with a number of companies on exactly this, because we need a near-term solution. There's so many great technologies being developed, but they are not going to be ready in the near term, and certainly not at the scale necessary, right? When we're talking about gigatons of carbon dioxide that we need to prevent from going into the atmosphere, this is really the only technology on the table that is ready right now. And the oil and gas industry have the capability and the infrastructure in place to do this. So it's my greatest hope, especially having worked in the industry for so many years, that the oil and gas industry steps up and actually kind of becomes the atmospheric services group, that they're actually responsible for reducing the emissions to meet the Paris Accords.
Can I ask a question on just policy around that? So the industry feels like we're through the third recession here in the last 5 years, and we're reeling just financially. How do you kind of think about the policy and financial incentives to essentially help the industry finance and build out infrastructure to actually clean up emissions over time?
That's a great question. So we've just hosted actually a big workshop where we talked about exactly this. So there is a policy called 45Q, which provides tax incentives for carbon capture and storage. I think there was some issues in the onset of that around the timeline of the project. It was sort of requiring that you do it in a 12-year time frame, which as anyone who has worked in the industry knows, that's not really a feasible payback time, right? We're looking at 25 or 30 years. But as those issues are being ironed out, I think it's becoming more and more feasible and attractive to the oil and gas companies. We have a carbon capture and storage initiative at Stanford, and it is getting a lot of attention right now, particularly in places like California. So if we're thinking about how we put all the pieces together, thinking about places where we want to make hydrogen, so I think down the road, we envision a world where we're going to be making, green hydrogen from excess renewable energy. But right now, what we have to work with commercially and in a way that's economically viable is making hydrogen from natural gas. And then you can imagine in California taking advantage of LCFS credits and also 45Q for carbon capture and storage to make this a net carbon zero proposition. So I really believe that we're moving in the right direction on that. And certainly I think the timing is right in terms of the oil and gas companies sort of reevaluating their strategies and their portfolios at large. And this is on the cards, I think, in the near term.
I'd say that I think many of us agree with everything you said, and some of the frustration, to pick up on a point that Maynard made before, is it just sort of doesn't resonate in the broader society. The securities of many of these companies have been absolutely destroyed. They're vilified in the press on a daily basis. Your very rational and very well articulated argument about natural gas being a bridge is said to be wrong. And and worse than that, we've got to ban all investment. In preparing for your appearance today and visiting with us, I did some research just looking around the website. Great website, by the way. Everybody should go see it. And your colleagues, Mark Thurber and Todd Moss, penned a note for the World Economic Forum entitled 12 Reasons Why Gas Should Be Part of Africa's Clean Energy Future, which I would encourage everybody to read because it's really well written and speaks to the point of energy poverty that you mentioned before. And if you'll humor me, I just wanted to read one paragraph from it, short paragraph. Given the seriousness of climate change, ban all fossil fuels everywhere is an intuitively appealing position. When applied to energy-deprived regions like Africa, however, ruling out natural gas will do far more harm than good on environmental, health, and development fronts. In the process, it will convince policymakers on the continent, perhaps not for the first time, that outside investors do not have their best interests at heart. There's Stanford University, the World Economic Forum, speaking logic and reason, and yet the World Bank has banned all investment in new oil and gas projects worldwide, everywhere. So I know you already talked about it, but I think it's so important. Energy poverty, like how do we get the World Bank to reverse this antagonism to natural gas and to see this vision that you so clearly and eloquently, paint for us?
It's a really great point, and so one of the things that we're doing is we're going to host a big event actually focused on gas in Africa, and we're going to invite policymakers from Africa, because I think if the policymakers and the government officials actually in Africa are demanding that they have access to natural gas through funding sources such as the World Bank, then it could change the course of that. But it is, I agree with you. It's a absolute travesty to lump natural gas in essentially with coal, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So, we're working to educate the powers that be, and certainly talking to people at the World Bank and through Energy for Growth Hub to try and, put some logical rationale into some of these decisions.
So maybe, Naomi, as we wrap up, I mean, this has been fantastic, and I think all of us are inspired by what you're doing. It's so great. What do you think the natural gas initiative at Stanford looks like in 10 years? Like, how are you thinking about how it continues to grow, and it plays such a central role in this debate now, but the debate's going to keep changing. What are you thinking about the future yourself?
Well, that's a great question. So I think so the natural gas initiative has kind of been on this had a lot of momentum, right, since its inception, and I think we're one of the largest affiliate programs at Stanford now. So, and certainly I am seeing a more diverse group of people interested. I think one of the reasons that that's the case is that we've continued to evolve, right? So we continue to sort of stay abreast of what's really happening on the ground, and starting things like the hydrogen focus group, right? Topics that are clearly going to be important, and technology is moving so quickly. So I think, 10, maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen the need for the natural gas initiative because nobody understood the promise of shale gas, right? And so as we evolve, I didn't bring my crystal ball today, but I think that the existing infrastructure, we are going to be so foolish if we don't utilize it in some capacity. And gas in general, not just natural gas, but hydrogen and other types of gas are going to be a part of our energy system. And so we'll continue to evolve as the technologies and the energy landscape evolves.
Well, I was thinking about this when Colin mentioned the Chinese and their 40-year energy plan. What was the last 40-year energy plan that was correct? So it seems like we all have to stay, you said the expression technology agnostic or fuel agnostic. We should all be that if we're going to solve these problems.
Yeah, I really believe that we should keep our eye on the ball, which is to reduce carbon emissions. And how we get there shouldn't be a political question. It should be driven by the technologies that we have available. And like any, good strategic plan, we should have a near-term, mid-term, and long-term outlook, and be willing to adjust as, perhaps tomorrow a wonder battery will be developed, right? And it will solve the storage problem. And then maybe we transition away from hydrogen into, looking at something else. I think, keeping the conversation based on the science is really the most important thing.
Well, we hear that a lot these days, and so we all need to try harder to do that.
It's tough, it's tough not to attach yourself to a certain technology and kind of feel responsible for it succeeding. But, at the end of the day, we all live on this planet, and we'll all succeed if we get carbon emissions down in a way that provides energy for everybody in an affordable way. So that's I keep coming back to those fundamental principles, right? We're all human beings and we deserve to live a high quality of life.
Nothing better to end on than that. Naomi Boness, thank you. And if you haven't, we'll attach a link to the Stanford's Natural Gas Initiative to the homepage that Colin was raving about. You all need to learn about it. TPH is looking forward to getting more involved out there. It's a wonderful thing. So thank you, Naomi, and thanks all of you.